He was humiliated, fired, and told he would never be more than a laborer. But years later, when he returns as a powerful businessman, he's faced with a choice that could change everything. Will he seek revenge, or prove that true success is built on something greater? David Miller wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. The sun was merciless, beating down on the construction site with unrelenting heat. His muscles ached from hours of labor, but he kept working, stacking bricks with practiced precision. It was an honest job, and he took pride in his work, even if others didn't see it the same way. "Faster, Miller. We're not paying you to daydream." The sharp voice belonged to Richard Wallace, the owner of the construction company. He stood a few feet away, arms crossed, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the dusty, sweat-streaked clothes of the workers. Richard's face twisted in an expression of disdain as he looked at David. "You people should be grateful to even have jobs." David clenched his jaw but didn't respond. He had learned a long time ago that speaking back to men like Richard only made things worse. Instead, he focused on his work, ignoring the heat and the insults. The site was bustling with activity. Men carried materials, hammers rang against steel beams, and saws sliced through wood. The skeletal framework of what would soon be a luxury apartment complex rose above them. But no matter how hard David and his fellow workers toiled, Richard Wallace never saw them as more than tools, expendable, replaceable. Later that afternoon, a problem arose. A shipment of materials had arrived late, delaying a crucial stage of the build. The workers gathered around as the foreman discussed possible solutions with Richard, who was growing increasingly impatient. "We need to reinforce this section before the next delivery," David said, stepping forward. "If we use temporary bracing here and distribute the load differently, we can keep things moving without compromising safety." Silence followed his words. Richard turned to him, amusement flickering across his face before twisting into a sneer. "Look at this. The bricklayer thinks he's an engineer." The workers chuckled nervously, but David held his ground. "It's a solid plan. It'll keep us on schedule." Richard laughed, the sound sharp and grating. "Listen, boy, you lay bricks. That's all you'll ever do. You think you're smart because you can talk fancy. Know your place." The words hit like a slap. David's fists clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to remain calm. He had grown up hearing things like that, being told he would never be more than a laborer, that his kind didn't belong in higher places. But he knew his worth, even if Richard didn't. "You don't like how I run things," Richard continued, stepping closer. "Then leave. I don't need some arrogant worker questioning my decisions." David took a deep breath, the anger simmering just beneath the surface. He could argue, could fight, but what would it change? Richard held all the power here. Without another word, David untied his work apron, tossed it to the ground and walked away. As he stepped off the site, his hands still shaking, he made a promise to himself. One day, he would never have to take orders from men like Richard Wallace again. David sat on the edge of his worn-out couch, staring at the eviction notice in his hands. His fingers tightened around the paper as reality settled in. Without a job, he had no way to pay rent. His savings were nearly gone, and the landlord wasn't willing to give him more time. He exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. The humiliation from his last day at the construction site still burned in his chest. Richard Wallace had taken more than just his job. He had stolen his dignity, his security. The weight of it all pressed against his ribs, making it hard to breathe. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. He opened it to find Michael Brown, his closest friend, standing there with a concerned look. "Man, I heard what happened," Michael said, stepping inside. "That bastard finally showed his true colors, huh?" David sighed. "I should have seen it coming." Michael sat on the couch, leaning forward. "So what's next?" David hesitated. He had no answer. The thought of begging for another job under someone like Richard made his stomach turn. But what else could he do? Michael clapped a hand on his shoulder. You ever think about working for yourself? David gave a dry chuckle. Doing what? I don't have money for that. Start small. Do private jobs. Repairs, renovations. Whatever you can get your hands on. The idea sounded ridiculous at first. Who would hire him without the backing of a big company? But as the night stretched on, David couldn't shake the thought. He had spent years breaking his back for someone else's success. Maybe it was time he built something of his own. But I have no tools, no materials, David countered. Michael leaned back, crossing his arms. I know a few people who could loan you some. And I've seen your work, man. Oh, good. Word will spread. David stared at his friend, the gears in his mind turning. And if it doesn't, then at least you tried. But I think you'll surprise yourself. By morning the decision was made. David grabbed an old notebook, scribbling down a plan. He had no money, no clients, but he had skill. And that was a start. The first job came quicker than expected. A neighbor needed a fence repaired. It wasn't much, but it was something. With borrowed tools and determination, David got to work, pouring every bit of skill and pride into the project. When he finished, the neighbor was beyond satisfied and promised to recommend him to others. More small jobs followed. Word began to spread. Each project brought in just enough money to scrape by. But more importantly, it fueled David's confidence. He wasn't just another laborer. He was a craftsman, and that realization changed everything. With one last glance at the eviction notice, he stood, determination settling in his chest. It was time to rebuild, not just his career but his future. David's hands were calloused, his muscles sore, but for the first time in a long time, he felt in control of his life. The small repair jobs had grown into steady work, enough to keep him afloat. He used what little he earned to reinvest in tools, buying second-hand equipment wherever he could. But he knew hard work alone wouldn't be enough. Sitting at a small table in a diner, he scribbled in his notebook, jotting down ideas on how to expand. He had talent, but talent wasn't enough in a world that valued credentials over experience. If he wanted to build something bigger, he needed knowledge. Real knowledge about business, contracts, and how the construction industry worked behind the scenes. Deep in thought, David looked up to see Lisa Carter standing over him, a warm smile on her face. She was an architect he had met through one of his jobs, and unlike most professionals in the field, she had treated him with respect from the start. Just trying to figure out my next move, he admitted, closing the notebook. Lisa sat across from him, setting her coffee on the table. I might be able to help with that. David raised an eyebrow. How so? You're great at what you do, but if you want to move up, you need to understand how this industry really works. You ever thought about learning more about project management? Bidding for contracts? David exhaled. I've thought about it, but I don't know where to start. Lisa slid a folded piece of paper toward him. This is a list of resources. Books, online courses, networking events. You should also consider getting licensed as a contractor. David unfolded the paper, scanning the list. And how exactly do I pay for all of this? Lisa smirked. Some of these resources are free. The rest, consider it an investment. If you want to be more than just another construction worker, you have to think like a businessman. Her words lingered in his mind long after she left. That night, David went home and researched everything on the list. He spent hours watching videos on business management, reading about construction permits, and learning how bidding for projects worked. The more he read, the clearer his path became. Within weeks, he began attending industry networking events, standing in rooms full of men in suits who barely glanced at him. It didn't matter. He listened, absorbed everything, and took note of the way deals were made. Then came his first real test. A local contractor needed extra hands for a renovation project, but had no interest in hiring an independent worker. David made his case, using the terminology he had studied, proving he understood more than just labor. The work. He landed the contract, not as a worker, but as a subcontractor. For the first time, David wasn't just laying bricks. He was learning how to build an empire. David's business was no longer just a dream, it was real. The small jobs had turned into larger projects, and the knowledge he had gained through study and networking was beginning to pay off. But he knew that to truly establish himself, he needed something bigger, something that would put his name on the map. That opportunity arrived in the form of a renovation project for a commercial building on the outskirts of town. The original contractor had backed out at the last minute, leaving the owners scrambling to find a replacement. Lisa, always looking out for him, recommended David for the job. "This could be your big break," she told him. "It's more responsibility than you've had before, but I know you can handle it." David met with the building owners, a group of skeptical investors who eyed him with doubt. He could feel the weight of their judgment, the unspoken question lingering in the air. Can this guy really handle a project of this scale? He took a deep breath and laid out his plan. He spoke confidently about timelines, materials, budget constraints, everything he had been studying. He knew he couldn't afford to sound unsure. After what felt like an eternity, one of the investors leaned back in his chair. "You seem to know your stuff," he admitted. "But we need results. If you can finish this job on time and within budget, we'll consider using you for future projects." It wasn't a guarantee, but it was a chance. David threw himself into the work. He hired a small but skilled team, ensuring that every worker understood the importance of the job. He oversaw every detail, from sourcing materials to coordinating schedules. The long days and sleepless nights tested him, but he refused to fail. As the deadline approached, the building began to transform. What had once been a rundown, neglected structure was now modern and polished. The investors visited the site regularly, watching with cautious optimism as David brought their vision to life. When the project was finally completed, not only had he met their expectations, he had exceeded them. The investors were impressed. "You delivered, Miller," one of them said. "We'll be in touch for more work." Walking away from that meeting, David knew one thing for certain. He wasn't just a laborer anymore. He was a businessman. David's reputation was growing. His success on the renovation project led to more contracts, and soon he was handling multiple projects at once. The long hours and endless challenges didn't faze him. He thrived under pressure. But with success came new enemies. One afternoon, as David reviewed blueprints in his small office, Michael burst through the door, his face tense. "You're not gonna believe this," he said, tossing a folded newspaper onto the desk. David picked it up and scanned the headline. "Miller Construction under investigation. Competitor raises concerns." His stomach clenched. "Who?" he asked, already knowing the answer. Michael sighed. "Richard Wallace. He's been spreading rumors that you're cutting corners, using cheap materials, endangering workers." David exhaled sharply, gripping the paper. He had expected resistance, but Wallace was playing dirty. Lisa, who had been reviewing contracts in the corner, looked up. "This could be bad. Even if there's no truth to it, perception matters." David leaned back, rubbing his temples. "So what do we do?" Michael shrugged. "We fight back. Publicly." Lisa shook her head. "Whoa. That's what he wants, attention, a reaction. We counter it by being better. No shortcuts, no mistakes. Let our work speak for itself." David nodded slowly. She was right. If they lost their integrity now, they'd prove Wallace right. Instead of engaging in a public battle, he doubled down on quality. Every project was checked twice. Every inspection passed flawlessly. Weeks passed, and Wallace's accusations began to lose momentum. Clients who worked with David saw the truth. His work spoke louder than Wallace's lies. Then, one evening, as David locked up his office, a familiar voice cut through the quiet. "Enjoying the success while it lasts, Miller." David turned to see Wallace leaning against a black car, a smirk on his face. "You got lucky once, but you're still just a worker playing businessman." David met his gaze, unwavering. "Build. You destroy. That's the difference between us." Wallace's smirk faltered just slightly before he climbed into his car and drove off. David watched him go, knowing one thing for certain. This war was far from over. David had faced challenges before, but nothing like this. Wallace's influence was stronger than he had anticipated. Banks hesitated to approve his loan applications, suppliers delayed shipments, and potential clients suddenly withdrew their interest. Wallace wasn't just trying to ruin his reputation. He was trying to strangle his business before it could grow any further. Sitting in his office late one night, David flipped through financial statements, the numbers tightening like a noose around his throat. If things didn't turn around soon, he would lose everything he had worked for. Michael sat across from him, arms crossed. "You can't let him win, man. You've come too far." Lisa, ever the strategist, leaned forward. "We need a new approach. Wallace controls the big players, so let's focus on smaller, independent investors. People who believe in your vision." David exhaled. "And where do we find them?" Lisa slid a piece of paper across the desk. "There's a networking event downtown tomorrow. Business owners, entrepreneurs, people looking for fresh talent. If we pitch this right, we might get the support we need." Doubt gnawed at David, but he knew they had no other option. The next evening, he walked into a sleek conference hall, adjusting his tie. The room buzzed with chatter, glasses clinking, and deals being made. This was Wallace's world, a world David had never belonged to. Yet, as he introduced himself, showcasing his projects and his commitment to quality, he saw something shift. People listened. They respected his work. By the end of the night, he had secured meetings with 3 potential investors. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was hope. A few weeks later, one of those investors, a retired developer named James Calloway, agreed to back him. "I like people who don't back down," Calloway said, shaking David's hand. "Prove to me you're as good as they say." With renewed funding, David pushed forward. His projects continued. His workers stayed employed. And slowly, Wallace's grip began to weaken. The tide was turning. But David knew one thing. This fight was far from over. David's company was no longer just surviving, it was growing. With Calloway's backing and a steady influx of projects, he was expanding his team and securing contracts beyond what he had ever imagined. But he knew Wallace wouldn't go down without a fight. One morning, Michael barged into the office, waving a letter. "Wallace just filed a lawsuit against us. Claims we stole one of his designs." David took the paper, scanning the legal jargon. It was baseless, a desperate attempt to slow him down. "He's grasping at straws." Lisa frowned. "Even if we fight this and win, it could drag on for months. Investors hate uncertainty." David exhaled, pressing his fingers to his temples. Wallace had money, connections, and experience in dirty tactics. But David had something stronger: resilience. "We go on the offensive," he said. "We highlight our success, our integrity, and we expose his failures. The industry already whispers about his shady dealings. It's time we make them listen." Lisa and Michael exchanged glances before nodding. Within days, David launched a media campaign showcasing his projects, the communities he was helping rebuild, and the ethical work his company was committed to. Simultaneously, Lisa gathered records of Wallace's financial missteps and worker complaints, leaking them strategically. The shift was immediate. Clients started pulling out of Wallace's deals. Banks reconsidered their trust in him. For the first time, he was on the defensive. Then the final blow came. Calloway, who had quietly been watching the war unfold, made a bold move. He acquired a significant stake in Wallace's company and forced him into a corner. When Wallace stormed into David's office days later, his face was a mask of barely contained rage. "You think you've won," he spat. "You're nothing but a construction worker who got lucky." David met his glare calmly. "I built something from nothing while you tore everything down. The difference between us. I earned my success." Wallace had no retort. He turned on his heel and left, slamming the door behind him. David let out a breath. This battle was over. But he knew the war was not. The storm that had been brewing for months finally hit Richard Wallace with full force. As David continued to expand, Wallace's company crumbled beneath the weight of its own corruption. Investors pulled out, banks revoked their support, and lawsuits piled up. His once mighty empire was collapsing brick by brick. David watched it unfold with a mix of satisfaction and caution. He had fought hard for his success, but he knew better than to underestimate a man like Wallace. Even cornered, he was dangerous. One evening, Lisa rushed into David's office, holding her phone out. "You need to see this." On the screen was a breaking news segment. Former construction mogul Richard Wallace indicted for fraud and corruption. Michael let out a low whistle. "Looks like karma finally caught up." David exhaled. He did this to himself. Reports flooded in. Financial misconduct, bribery, worker safety violations. Everything Wallace had tried to hide was now exposed to the world. His arrogance had blinded him to the fact that he wasn't invincible. Then came the final blow. His company officially declared bankruptcy. David sat back in his chair, staring out the window. It was over. The man who had once tried to destroy him had now destroyed himself. But David wasn't celebrating. He had learned something through this battle. True success wasn't about tearing others down. It was about building something stronger. He turned to Lisa and Michael. "It's time to focus on the future." Wallace had fallen. Now, it was David's turn to rise even higher. With Wallace's company in ruins, an unexpected opportunity arose. His assets were being liquidated, including his once thriving construction firm. David had spent years battling against the man who humiliated him. And now he had the chance to own everything Wallace had built. Sitting in a sleek office high above the city, David stared at the paperwork in front of him. The offer was clear. He could buy Wallace's company for a fraction of its former worth. It would be a full-circle moment, a chance to take over the very empire that had once tried to crush him. Lisa and Michael sat across from him, waiting for his decision. "This is poetic justice, David," Michael said. "You'd be taking everything from him." Lisa, however, remained quiet, studying David carefully. "But is this what you want? Or is it just revenge?" David sighed, rubbing his hands together. He had fought for so long, endured humiliation, hardship, and sacrifice. But now, sitting on top of the world, he realized something. He didn't need Wallace's company to prove his worth. He leaned back in his chair and shook his head. "I don't need to buy his legacy. I'm building my own." Michael blinked in surprise. "You're passing on this?" David nodded. "Wallace's company represents everything wrong with this industry. I'd rather create something better from the ground up than resurrect his failures." Lisa smiled knowingly. "Then let's focus on the future." David took a deep breath, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. He wasn't just winning against Wallace. He was choosing a different path, one built on integrity, not revenge. The paperwork remained unsigned as David walked away from the deal, proving that true success wasn't about destroying enemies but about building something that lasts. David stood on the balcony of his new headquarters, overlooking the city that had once seemed impossible to conquer. The skyline stretched before him, a testament to everything he had built, not on revenge but on resilience and integrity. Michael approached, handing him a glass of whiskey. "You really did it, man. You built something bigger than Wallace ever could." David smiled, taking a slow sip. "Because I didn't build it on greed. I built it on respect." Lisa joined them, holding a folder. "We just closed the deal on the new affordable housing project. It's going to provide hundreds of homes for families who need them." David took the folder, flipping through the pages. This was what success looked like. Creating opportunities, lifting people up, making a real difference. Just then, the receptionist buzzed in through the intercom. "David, there's someone here to see you." "Richard Wallace." Michael and Lisa exchanged glances. David set his drink down. "Send him in." Wallace entered the office, looking like a man who had lost everything. His once expensive suit was wrinkled, his arrogance replaced with desperation. "David, I need work. I lost everything." For a long moment, David studied the man who had once tried to break him. He could humiliate Wallace, turn him away, make him feel the same pain he had inflicted. Instead, he extended a hand. "Everyone deserves a second chance. But you'll have to earn it." Wallace hesitated, then took the handshake. His expression filled with something close to disbelief. As he walked away, Michael whistled. "Didn't see that coming." Lisa smirked. "That's what makes him different." David turned back to the city, feeling lighter than he ever had. He hadn't just won. He had redefined what winning meant. True victory wasn't about revenge. It was about building something that would last far beyond him. And he had done exactly that. What would you do if the person who once humiliated you came back asking for help? Would you turn them away, seeking the revenge they deserve, or would you choose a different path? One that proves your success is greater than their failure. David built an empire not on hate, but on resilience. But was he right to offer a second chance? What would you have done? ***. Click on the video on the screen to continue this journey of self-discovery and explore more stories that challenge how we see power, success, and forgiveness. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe for more stories that inspire, provoke, and make you think. See you in the next one.